Thank you, Tino. So just to introduce our two presenters for this evening, they're two Christian brothers. So we're going to hear first of all from Brother Kevin Cawley. And Kevin is a representative of the Adventist International at the UN in New York. And he's also the executive director of the Thomas Berry Forum at Iona University in New York. And he publishes every month a newsletter called Carbon Rangers. So for many years, Kevin has been very interested in care of the earth, Laudato Si, and he publishes this newsletter every month. So that's Kevin Cawley, who'll be our first presenter. And our second presenter is another Christian brother, Terry Dowling. Terry's a Christian brother from South Africa. And Terry, again, has a big interest in care of the earth and the whole question of human rights. And Kevin Cawley will talk a little bit about the background to the situation we're in today in relation to the climate crisis. And Terry Dowling will bring us more up to date with things that have been happening very recently. At the moment, the Human Rights Council is meeting in Geneva, and Terry has been following some of the sessions of the Council very closely, and he'll share some of that with us in his presentation this evening. So our two presenters are very welcome, and I now hand over to Kevin Cawley in New York.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Tino, and thank you, Terry. And thank you all for being here today. I'm going to share a screen. I have a few slides to send your way. Making sure they fit up there. Have they showed up?
Yeah,
Great.
perfectly.
Okay. We're good to go.
Yeah.
And the question that frames the whole conversation today is the 1.5C question, 1.5 Celsius. Is Earth and humanity on track? That's the goal set at the Paris Climate Agreement, which Kevin just mentioned. And we're going to see a few pieces of that conversation. Just to start it off, reminder to all, and we probably don't need to see this one, but it's basically what's going on. We have this sun and the earth, and the sun's rays hit the earth. Solar energy is absorbed, it gets converted into heat, and then it sends back long wave radiation. Some of that comes back at us because the greenhouse gases, that blue line across the middle, basically that's the carbon dioxide that we've been putting out into the atmosphere. That's bouncing back the heat. And what's happening is the planet is heating up, the temperature is rising, and we get what they call radiative forcing. Right now, it's about 1 watt per square meter. That's what that little symbol is at the bottom. We measure this CO2 in parts per million, ppm. It's in the atmosphere. The safe level is that on the graph there at the 350 parts per million, which was around the end of the last century, 1990. It was sort of in good balance, but since then it's been getting worse and worse. And we'll see in a minute that it's been getting worse for many, many years. Right now we're at 418 parts per million. That's an increase 68.4 parts per million above a safe level, which we went past in 1990. So we're going in a bad direction on the carbon. This is a sample of what it looks like over a long period of time. This is 800,000 years. And you can see the CO2 concentration in parts per million in the blue down there. And you can see it goes up, it comes down, it goes up, it comes down. So it's been in sort of a back and forth model, but the safe place is to 350 parts per million, which is about the middle of the graph there. You can see it's once or twice it's gotten that high. However, the bad news is if you slide over to the right-hand side, you'll notice that suddenly it's way up in this corner. So the parts per million are well over 400. You can see the 400 parts per million there. We're up there in this neighborhood, and that's a very bad sign because over that 800,000 years, we've never been in this position with respect to carbon dioxide. So we do have a crisis. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, starting in 2018, they've been issuing these reports for many years, but we're looking at the 2018 report where they started to narrow down the concerns to the 1.5 Celsius versus 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And their major findings are in that report, which is available on the internet. But for us today, half a degree means something. It means the difference between a world with coral reefs and Arctic summer sea ice and a world without them. To stay below 1.5 C requires rapid reductions of GHG emissions worldwide, and most scenarios of that include the carbon dioxide removal. That is the CO2 that's already up there. We need to find a way to pull it back. Now, this is 2018, so we're actually looking at some history here, and as it's been pointed out, yesterday was the 2023 iteration of the IPCC Special Report AR6, and that one sounded the alarm even louder about this particular question of 1.5C and what it might mean for us. The other problem that perhaps wasn't clear yesterday, and perhaps it's worth mentioning, is that this debate is so widespread and accepted in our culture. The debate is so common. It has influenced the climate scientists in their findings, so they tend to understate the problem. That's not a good sign, especially when the signs are so bad that they're not really saying the whole thing. They're understating for lots of reasons. And recently, Scientific American, about 10 years ago, started looking at these, and they checked 20 years worth of projections, and they found that the IPCC has consistently underestimated the pace and the impacts of global warming. Again, that is not good news, but it's something that they have recently been able to say in public. And so we're going to be looking at some of those concerns ourselves and what their implications might be. The impacts that are ahead of schedule are these, and these are a series of disturbing signals here. Half of the tipping points that are mentioned in those reports are already 100 years ahead of schedule. So what we thought was going to happen 100 years from now, it is already happening this year. Sea level rise, for an example, is 80% greater than we projected for this year. Air temperature in the Arctic is 80 years ahead of what we thought would be the warming trend. The ocean temperature is 40 years ahead of schedule. Ocean acidity, which was mentioned earlier, is 62 years ahead. There's a very specific number there. Permafrost collapse. If you're in Siberia, you already know about this. It's 70 years ahead of the projected schedule from the earlier IPCC reports. The Arctic sea ice is 70 years ahead. Basically, the Arctic ice is going to be disappearing, so the North Pole, as we call it. Antarctic is collapsing, but it's 100 years ahead of schedule. Much more disturbing because the Antarctic ice is sitting on land, and when that goes into the water, it does impact sea level rise. The Amazon flip, it's kind of a disturbing phrase, but it means as the rainforest goes over and stops being a rainforest because of a number of problems, one of which is deforestation, another one is forest fires, and they're turning it into grassland. That's 70 years ahead of schedule. An example of what we're talking about, we might get a chance to look at this. This is the Brunt ice shelf separation. Now, in that image of change, I'm going to have to jump out here. I think I can get to it and send it out as a share. Tino, let me know, is that being shared?
No.
So I'm going to go out,
yeah,
huh?
Best is to go out, yes.
All right, here we go. I'm going to share it this way. How are we doing?
Perfect.
Okay. So if you don't mind looking at this for a minute or two, you'll see my pointer is over here on the Antarctic mainland, and then you can see the change in shading. This is the white ice part, and this is the gray shelf of ice in the Antarctic. And this event happened about a month ago, and the beginning of February, actually, when this occurred, and we have satellite images to show what's going on. So this is Antarctica at the beginning of February, and here's our situation. This little marker here tells us this is a shelf of ice 50 kilometers wide. And here's our moment of truth. Bang. So that's 50 kilometers of ice suddenly disappearing from the shelf and entering the water in Antarctica. Massive amount of displacement, and that ice is not coming back. It's entering the sea, and it becomes water like the rest of the sea, and eventually that kind of activity will increase sea level rise everywhere. But that's an example of what we're talking about when we say the Antarctic is melting faster because it's warming faster, and that kind of event is happening. We have this particular one because we have NASA has been helping us with their different satellite images. So that's our Brunt ice shelf, and you can see it. It's the before and after picture on the next slide. Again, not a good sign and disturbing, especially if you're on a small island state. Now we have, in addition to that, the consequences of this 1 degree rise are going to be various, but they're not all right now, but they're all going to be impactful. And let's see what we can look about there. In a worst case scenario, for every 1 degree Celsius rise, they're estimating 1 billion people will be forced to migrate or endure insufferable heat. This is the report from yesterday. That's their estimate in terms of how many people are we talking about and going to be suffering. And that says to us that area is home to 1/3 of the world's population will experience the same temperatures now as the Sahara Desert within 50 years. And you can see that the mean annual temperature there is 29 or so. But for the most of humanity, the last 10,000 years, we've been in a very comfy niche, as they say, about 11 to 15 degrees C. Massively different from what is coming at us in the next 50 years if we don't address these questions. Sample of what that looks like. This is Kenya, and the herders there are desperate so much for water that it's pretty much not accessible unless you dig a very large hole and end up trying to feed your poor animals by taking a bucket out of the ground and working it that way. Not a good sign. We know also that the population declines in our fellow creatures has been staggering. According to the report from last year from the World Wildlife Federation Living Planet report, average population size of these mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians declined by almost 70% in just the last 50 years. Almost 70% of those creatures have disappeared in only 50 years. One of the remedies that is proposed to help us pull back the carbon, stop the carbon problem is carbon offsets. You may have heard of that. Some of us who fly airplanes occasionally will always check the box to say, I'll do a carbon offset and I'll send $30 to somebody to plant a tree while I fly across the ocean. It turns out that these offsets approved by the world's leading certifier and used by Disney, Shell, Gucci, and other corporations are basically worthless. And they could make global heating worse, according to a new investigation. If you've been reading the Guardian newspaper, this was about a week ago. And since then, the group called Vera, which was the carbon offset crowd, has fessed up and said, we're going to change our parameters and we're going to get this right. Well, we'll see. But that's a disturbing feature because these companies are very large. They reach everywhere. And now they're being told, well, you really thought you were doing good, but you're not. We know that plants and animals can absorb carbon. We know that not animals so much, but plants absorb carbon and soil absorbs carbon. Photosynthesis, we're all familiar with that. But the difficulty there is there's a limit. Nearly all of that absorption is eventually returned to the atmosphere through decay or ingestion by animals or forest fires. Every time you see a forest fire, that's carbon being sent back into the atmosphere. So the amount of carbon that plants and soils can reabsorb before reaching saturation is a limited amount. Okay, oceans help, right? Yes, oceans are our friend. They absorb about 23% of the greenhouse gas. But these carbon sinks also weaken eventually in response to continuing emissions. So the plants and the soils and the oceans are all doing what they can, but it's not enough. It's only about half the carbon that goes out. So soils and land plants, about 31%. You saw the oceans, about 23%. You can do a simple math and you know we haven't got it. We still have more than half of the carbon still doing damage. Well, what are states doing about this problem, this challenge? And the best example we have right now is the states did address this in, as Kevin Mullen mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals or Agenda 2030. This is 2015, after 3 years of negotiations at the UN and the Economic and Social Council in New York. They agreed to 17 goals, Sustainable Development Goals, with 176 targets that the planet has agreed every member state is going to try to address this in their own way, on their own terms, but they're heading in a good direction. So you can see, we've exploded the diagram a bit, that the biosphere at the base, which is land and oceans and water and sanitation and climate, holding up the rest of it. The second layer there, the society layer, talking about no poverty and health and education and gender equity, et cetera, and no hunger. And then the top layer there about jobs and equality and sustainable consumption. Surmounting everything is the little blue 17 goal, because when they got all these organized, they said, well, how are we going to pay for this? And that's when they decided they needed partners. So that's the basic model, what member states are trying to do. And each summer, recently, there's been a little confederation of countries meet in New York and say, basically check report cards, how are we doing? Now, refresher, as Kevin mentioned, Laudato Si was 2015, Pope Francis, that was around May. In September of 2015, Pope was in New York at the UN, and that was just the same day they finally passed the Sustainable Development Goals. He was there to cheer them on, and I think that was a lovely gesture on their part to General Assembly, waited till he was there to vote yes. The Paris Climate Accord occurred that December. So a very short, compact calendar for all the good things that could have happened. And now just the beginning of March the 4th in New York, after many, many years of negotiations, the UN Oceans Treaty was finally arrived at in terms of at least the language of the negotiators. It still has to be translated into the 6 official languages. Then it's sent out for ratification. It takes force or enters into force in our terms when 60 nations have ratified it. So that's still an ongoing process, but it is progress because that conversation had been going on for some 20 years. And it's addressing the questions of jurisdiction beyond national jurisdictions, that is the high seas. Who is in charge out there? And basically nobody was, and nobody really is until we get this treaty in order. But it is a sign of progress. 90% of the biomass of the sea is in the open oceans, and it's been uncontrolled. So we're hoping this will help to make things more civilized out there. There are still challenges in the fossil fuel transition. The global north and global south differ on those responses, as we know. We're all aware of that. Small island states are in desperate times right now because of the sea level rise. Developing nations are resisting the phase out of fossil fuels, basically because they're looking at, they say, the rest of us, the rich countries, saying, you did it, now why can't we do it? You have India, China, and South Africa in particular, who are still going to be burning coal. China has issued permits for another 168 coal burning power plants in the next few years. Developing nations are watching this. They think it's unfair that the wealthy countries are getting away with that. Transnational corporations are an issue. I think Terry will mention this again in his presentation. They're basically invading the space of all of the efforts we're making. In example was in Sharm el-Sheikh in the COP conference on climate. Just recently, there were at least 600 multinational corporations who got credentials to go to that meeting. And I'm sure, as we're aware, they've begun to massage all of the agreements. And that's part of the reason that the IPCC ends up underestimating things. So that's another problem we haven't solved. The fossil fuel industry continues exploration for oil, despite all of the signs that you can't do that anymore if you're going to try to help the planet. Governments are continuing to subsidize the fossil fuel industry. A lot of partisan politics is dividing everybody on energy policy, in particular in the United States, as we know. The uncertainty as to best practices is an issue. How do we get to the renewables? How do we start getting away from coal and going to wind and solar? Nothing is simple about that. Also, many industries depend on fossil fuels. Your utility companies right now burn coal to make electricity. If you're making steel, you need to burn coal to make steel and concrete. So you have a lot of that overlap. That's a problem. Also, justice for workers displaced by transitions to renewables. That's still an issue. And the cry of the earth, as we know from Francis, is also the cry of the poor. And last, but hardly least, war in Ukraine has unbalanced every equation right now, especially about energy dynamics globally. Laudato talked about all these problems in a general way, but specifically talked about them in terms of a crisis because the solutions are just out of reach. There's a lot of opposition to these solutions. And there's a general lack of interest, says Francis, right at the beginning. This is paragraph 14 of Laudato. And he names it. He says obstructionist attitudes, even on the part of believers, can range from denial of the problem to indifference, nonchalant resignation, or blind confidence in technical solutions. We require a new and universal solidarity. He's very clear that this is a serious issue for all of us. And he's also clear in his own language about what has to happen. Many things have to change, but we human beings, above all, need to change. He's calling us out. We lack an awareness of our common origin, of our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shared with everyone. It's toward the end of the document, paragraph 202. He's very clear also. The Creator does not abandon us. He never forsakes his loving plan or repents of having created us. Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. So Francis is clearly an optimist about this. That's the very beginning of Laudato, paragraph 13. We also know that Laudato Si is a wonderful place to make partners. In the paragraph 14, he talks about that. He said, we need a conversation, which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. Again, Francis calling everybody together. The worldwide ecological movement has already made considerable progress. He's aware of that. He knows people are doing good things. And he's talking about many organizations who are committed to raising awareness of these challenges. I just put a few logos up from partners in New York, particularly on a lot of these questions. So you can see the Edmund Rice logo, and then the Dominican family logo, and then this is a charity of Our Lady of the Good Shepherd, also partners with us in New York. I remind us too that this is all connected to basic Catholic social teaching, which has been always a feature of the Catholic position on these questions. And they're basically four pillars: the common good, the dignity of the human person, solidarity, and subsidiarity. We know these teachings from our own background. If we're in a Catholic education system, we know we still talk about them, and we know that they're very important because they do form a good foundation for everything else that's built on them. Francis's insight in 2015 is there, and also he's reaffirmed it in his 2020 encyclical Fratelli Tutti. Everything is interrelated. There's an integral quality to human development that we need to keep paying attention to. I bring forward now Thomas Berry because I think one of the points that Thomas makes that maybe doesn't get a lot of attention in Francis's encyclicals is the other than human. Thomas was always aware that renewal of life on the planet must be based on the continuity between the human and the other than human as a single integral community. Now, Thomas was telling us this 40 years ago, 50 years ago. The continuity is crucial. Once this continuity is recognized and accepted, then we will have fulfilled the basic condition that will enable the human to become more present to the earth in a mutually enhancing manner. He's always conscious that this is not just about us. This is about everything and everybody, all the life on the planet. There are some attempts now at solutions about this question of drawing back the carbon. This is a group called Drawdown. I recommend them as a place of confidence in the sense that they do have some ways of going about pulling back the carbon, if you want to call it that. They have they have listed 100 solutions. They've since revised this. This is from 2017. So it's getting more and more refined, and I think it's worth a look. The danger, of course, is a lot of it is technology, and we have to be careful about pushing everything over to we'll get better technology and solve it. That's not going to help the whole story. That's a moral hazard, really. What can one person do? Basically, stop being one person. You can join the Laudato Si action platform. The model there is see and judge and act. Pay attention. What are you looking at? Make a judgment about it. Is this activity really advancing the safety of the planet? And then act. Do something about it. A lot of the time, it's just join a group or contact your legislature or get into public action or civil protest, letters to the editor, prayer and fasting. Why not? That's always been a feature of our world in religion. And then keep learning and stay informed. One of the ways of staying informed is to please pay attention to what's happening, especially at the UN, because I think they're doing a good job at directing us. Also, one more commercial. Today is World Forest Day, just so happens. And I'll mention that the drivers of deforestation in Latin America, generally speaking, it's about land becoming grazing land for cattle. And it's also complex. We know about corporations. JBS, what's that? It's a Brazilian company, but it turns out it's the third largest meat company in North America. Even though they're cutting down the forests in the Amazon, their meat company is being based down there, but it's really one of the biggest meat companies in North America. So we have to watch out where these transnationals are showing up. Thank you for your kind attention.
This last month almost in Geneva, the Human Rights Council has been meeting, and an environment and human rights has almost been a big focus over here. And the special rapporteur for human rights and the environment, David Boyd, he gave his report at the Human Rights Council, and Edmund Rice International also participated in the interactive dialogue with him. Besides that, there have been lots of events, side events around the environment that have been taking place here in Geneva. And one person has been keeping touch with them and participating in them. And that's Terry from our team here in Geneva. And so now I'm going to hand over to Terry to share with you some of the highlights and what he has learned and picked up from these meetings that he has been part of. So over to you, Terry.
So greetings, everyone, and thank you, Tina, and thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Kevin Cawley in New York. I would like you to keep in mind as we go through the next presentations what Kevin Cawley has highlighted, Laudato Si, Catholic social teaching, and what Thomas Berry said there at the end. And from Thomas Berry, we've got to realize what he is pushing for is that Earth is primary, the human is secondary. Earth rights are primary, and human rights flow out of Earth rights. We've got to get that right. So what I'm going to try now is show you 4 little videos of what's been happening in the Geneva area in terms of all this. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. Thank you, Tina. Can we see that, Tina?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay.
Have you ticked the 2 boxes?
Yes, I have, Tina.
Wonderful.
Okay. On the 8th of March, it was International Women's Day. And the Geneva Environment Program, and it's in a network of many groups in Geneva here, had a webinar where they invited many speakers, one being David Boyd. You can see in the little picture at the side, he's there on the second from the left. But one of the speakers was Ambassador Tavita Levy from Samoa. And she spoke about what a small island was doing in trying to handle the climate change and all the challenges that come with it. And she speaks from a woman's point of view, and she'll speak about their communal efforts in protecting their island and the challenges to have gender-based analysis of the effects and disaggregated data collected, especially for a small island like theirs. So let's listen to what she shared on that little talk, on that event.
I am privileged to celebrate with you this morning an important day to acknowledge and recognize the contribution of women to all areas of sustainable development. The theme of the pathway for the development of Samoa is empowering communities, building resilience, and inspiring growth. The pathway focuses on people based on shared values of fairness, respect, inclusiveness, and responsibility, both for one another and our land and ocean resources. Christian principles and our Samoa culture and traditions underpin our way of life. We are a communal people taking collective responsibility for each other, our ainga and families, and the good of all in our villages, our communities, and country. We believe in shared prosperity, social equity, social security, and the sustainable use and protection of our natural resources. These values and customs have shaped our approach to development over the years in the face of growing economic, social, environmental challenges and the recent health pandemic. Samoa is a small island developing state in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. As such, the ocean is significant to our well-being, livelihoods, food security, resilience, and the sustainable development of our economy through fisheries and tourism. The Blue Pacific has the collective commitment to ensure that the security of our shared ocean geography, resources, and ecosystems therein, including from the impacts of climate change and disasters, as we are experiencing the rising sea levels, saltwater intrusion, crop damage, loss of fish stocks, intensifying frequency of king tides, and natural disasters. Recent extreme weather events in the Pacific region brings a sobering reminder of the vulnerability that small island developing countries face. As we've seen, Vanuatu has declared a national state of emergency yesterday, following the devastation caused by twin cyclones and earthquakes last week. The Samoa Policy for Gender Equality identifies 7 key strategic priorities, including the environment, with key outcomes to increase the visibility, contribution, and engagement of women and girls in agriculture, climate change, natural resource management, and disaster preparedness and response, especially those women and girls facing multiple and intersecting barriers and forms of discrimination. The same policy document acknowledges that there is relatively little gender analysis of climate change and calls for the need to strengthen the collection and disaggregation of data by sex and gender, and to ensure analysis is consistent with the gender transformative approach. Empowering women and girls to capitalize on the opportunities from technological advancements and bridging the digital gap can further support their participation from rural areas and remote islands in the climate change discourse. Women's role in our families, communities, and country as nurturers, homemakers, advisors, facilitators, mitigators, and leaders are foundational elements of agents of positive change. Samoa is one of 27 countries in the world with women as head of government or state.
So there you have Ambassador Tavita Levy speaking about the role of women and children that is vital in this climate debate, and to include them because they are the nurturers. They form part of the whole community and a very important part of the community aspect, especially in a small island state like Samoa. The next speaker is going to be Dr. David Boyd. He's the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and he gave his report to the Human Rights Council on March the 9th and 10th. He interacted 3 times with the Human Rights Council, and we're going to show you clips of those 3 interactions. And in this first one, he speaks about the vital role of women and girls in the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and the challenges faced by the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, and the positive impact they have on this when they are involved. So I leave it to you to listen to Dr. David Boyd.
75 years ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declared that all human beings are born free and equal in rights and dignity. Yet despite progress towards gender equality, in some states, systemic discrimination persists. Discriminatory laws, outdated social cultural norms, and harmful stereotypes continue to restrict the political and economic power of women, girls, and gender diverse persons in every state and every sphere of society. Women comprise 70% of the world's poor. Women do 3 times more unpaid care work than men, and only 16% of government ministers are women. The planetary environmental crisis affects everyone, everywhere, but not equally. Women and girls are excluded from participating in environmental decision-making and enjoying a fair share of nature's benefits, and bear a disproportionate share of the burden of impacts related to the climate emergency, the collapse of biodiversity, and pervasive toxic pollution. In its pioneering resolutions from the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, the UN recognized the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and emphasized the critical importance of achieving gender equality. Sustainable development depends on the gender transformative realization of the right to a healthy environment. And gender transformative means capable of changing the norms and systems that perpetuate gender inequality. As demonstrated by their impressive contributions to protecting the environment, women and girls are powerful and transformative agents of change. They must be viewed as equal, indispensable partners and leaders in the transition to a just and sustainable future. The voices of women and girls must be heard, their ideas implemented, and their work rewarded. Yet gender-based stereotypes, inequalities, and discrimination restrict women and girls' enjoyment of their right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. For example, due to gendered cooking responsibilities, millions of women and girls die prematurely every year because of household air pollution from unclean fuels and inefficient cook stoves. Lack of access to clean water causes the death of 800,000 women and girls every year. And the task of water collection in households that lack water on the premises falls upon women and girls in 80% of cases. Women and girls make up almost half of the world's agricultural workforce, and yet women own less than 20% of the world's land because of economic, cultural, and legal barriers. Indigenous, Afro-descendant, peasant, and local community women and girls steward their territories and use them for food, water, medicine, cultural and spiritual purposes, and livelihoods. But their land and tenure rights are under-recognized and insecure. Women and girls are disproportionately vulnerable to the adverse health effects of toxic substances, enduring heart disease, respiratory illnesses, cancer, and adverse reproductive health effects, including early puberty, infertility, miscarriages, and birth defects. Women and girls are more vulnerable to climate impacts. Over 80% of the people displaced by climate-related natural disasters are women and girls. Environmental crises worsen poverty, cause displacement, and fuel gender-based violence, including physical, psychological, and sexual violence, and child marriage. Militarized efforts to facilitate environmentally destructive activities heighten the risks of gender-based violence, especially on Indigenous lands. Women and girls lack equal access to environmental and climate information, are often excluded from environmental decision-making, and lack access to justice and remedies when their rights are being threatened or violated. That's the bad news. But women and girls from around the world, especially from Indigenous, Black, and other racially marginalized communities, have an incredible and inspiring history of work as environmental human rights defenders. The participation of women and girls in designing and implementing climate and environmental actions results in better outcomes for everyone. There is strong positive correlations between higher proportions of women in political positions of political authority, and lower carbon footprints, higher ratification of environmental treaties, and most importantly, stronger environmental standards. So my report actually includes a good practices annex, which articulates more than 200 good practices from more than 100 states.
So there you have it, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, especially women and girls. And what David Boyd is emphasizing, that the better solutions happen when women and girls are involved. Now think about Greta Thunberg and also the young girls that she has brought together in their actions for climate change. So the next one is going to deal with the sustainability goals, which Kevin Cawley has already spoken about, the 2030 agenda. And David Boyd will underpin that all these goals are underpinned by, or he'll emphasize that all these goals are underpinned by human rights law. And he's going to speak especially to SDG 5, gender equality.
Last fall, I presented a report on the Sustainable Development Goals and the right to a healthy environment at the General Assembly. And I just want to quickly share the key takeaway message from that report, which is that there continues to be a widespread misperception among states that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are merely aspirations, when in fact the SDGs are built on the bedrock of international human rights law. Every one of the 17 SDGs has a solid foundation in human rights law. 153 of the 169 SDG targets are directly connected to international human rights obligations. So it's imperative that states begin to treat the SDGs not as optional aspirations, but as obligations that must be fulfilled. Friends and colleagues, humanity must create a world that is gender equitable and ecologically sustainable. Neither can really be achieved without the other. Only rights-based, systemic, and gender transformative changes can achieve a future where everyone, including every woman and girl, enjoys their right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Girls requires all states to take appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women and girls. States must mobilize the maximum available resources in their gender transformative actions to respect, protect, and fulfill women and girls' right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. States must empower women and girls through education, access to information, equitable participation in decision-making, and timely, affordable access to justice and effective remedies. States must provide strong protection for women and girls who are environmental human rights defenders. Amend gender-blind climate and environmental laws to specify the rights of women and girls. Ensure equal land ownership and tenure rights for all people, and employ whole-of-government approaches, recognizing that the entire range of government institutions must be gender transformative in order for women and girls to enjoy their right to a healthy environment without discrimination. A few examples of specific actions to fulfill the right to a healthy environment for women and girls include improving household air quality through universal access to clean cooking and heating technologies, and reductions in outdoor air pollution to meet the latest World Health Organization guidance, prioritizing those communities that are enduring the worst air quality. Ensuring universal access to safe water and sanitation by prioritizing schools, healthcare facilities, workplaces, and households that lack these essential services. Supporting the transition to agroecological food systems in which women and girls sustainably produce and consume healthy food. Strengthening regulations on chemicals that disproportionately harm women and girls, empowering women and girls to conserve, protect, and restore biodiversity and ecosystems, and guaranteeing that they have an equal share of the benefits of nature, preserving a safe climate through ambitious mitigation, adaptation, and climate finance actions that address the specific needs of women and girls, eliminating gender-based violence, and monitoring the sex and gender disaggregated impacts of these actions. Climate and environmental actions must prioritize women and girls facing heightened risks of vulnerability, including those from Indigenous, racial and ethnic minority groups, women and girls with disabilities, older women, women and girls living in poverty, and internally displaced refugee and migrant women and girls.
So there you have it. As we know, the SDGs are interlinked and intersectional, and not one can be more important than the other. But implementing states' obligations in terms of SDG 5, gender equality, will go a long way to bringing them all together, as he's tried to emphasize in this, what you've just seen. Now, the last one is where David Boyd speaks about some of the positive things that states and other organizations are doing, but then he speaks about the need for finance to fight the climate challenges and also loss and damage and all that. But then he also ends with speaking about the adverse effect of transnational companies, how they bring litigation against various states for what they're trying to do. So please listen to this one.
The recommendations in my report, which I won't repeat, but are focused on education, empowerment, and the acceleration of ambitious rights-based climate and environmental action. And I also want to say there's a tremendous amount of work in this area that's been done by other UN bodies, including the Commission on the Status of Women, the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, UN Women, UNDP, UNEP, UNICEF. And so I think there's a wide body of recommendations that can be drawn upon. And that brings us to the next point, is how do we actually ensure implementation? There are so many examples that we've heard in the past 2 days of states that have strong gender action plans, strong gender equality in legislation. And one of the primary obstacles, in my view, is something that we don't like to talk about here. It's money. And when I did my report on the Sustainable Development Goals for the GA last year, I learned that there is a multi-trillion-dollar gap in financing for the Sustainable Development Goals. We are behind schedule, and we will not achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals unless we access new sources of financing. And the same exact problem faces us with respect to our actions in responding to the climate crisis. Again, a multi-trillion-dollar shortfall. So in my report last fall to the GA, I outlined 7 specific actions that could be taken to find the missing trillions of dollars, which include such things as redirecting $1.8 trillion a year in environmentally damaging subsidies towards environmentally restoring and protecting subsidies. Also, using the polluter pays principle to impose pollution taxes, a wealth-based tax, and others. And I also want to emphasize that we all owe a debt to Prime Minister Mia Mottley of the Barbados for the Bridgetown Initiative. This is one of the most creative and intelligent climate and development financing proposals that has ever been conceived, and it would mobilize literally trillions of dollars to tackle the development and climate challenges faced by developing countries, including such things as including a climate-related disaster clause in all loan instruments, so that when, for example, a small island state is struck by a climate-related typhoon or cyclone, they can suspend payments on that loan for a period of 2 years, which gives them the fiscal operating room to deal with the impacts of that disaster. And the lender is made whole by adding 2 years to the end of that loan instrument. Similarly, another aspect of the Bridgetown Initiative involves creating a fund for loss and damage. Loss and damage represents the costs that are being inflicted on climate vulnerable nations, already estimated at more than $100 billion a year. But consider this proposal from the small island developing states. Air passenger travel levy of just $25 per flight would generate $100 billion a year. So we know that the air travel industry is not subject to the climate change regime. We know that air travel is predominantly the domain of wealthy people on this earth who have largely caused the climate crisis. So there are some very clear solutions out there. We also need to expand eligibility for concessional finance. Many of these small island developing states have to borrow money at commercial rates to pay for the impacts of the climate crisis, which exacerbates their debt problems. A related financial issue, which I'm going to be addressing in a future report, is a problem that is increasingly intense around the world, and that relates to what are called investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms in international trade and investment treaties. Now, this may seem like something that's far removed from the Human Rights Council, but let me assure you, it is not. We are seeing an incredible rise in lawsuits being brought using these mechanisms against sovereign states for taking climate and environmental action that fulfills their environmental, climate, and human rights obligations. For example, on my country visit to Slovenia last year, I learned that Slovenia is being sued for 500 million euros by a British company that wanted to frack for natural gas. Netherlands has been sued for billions of euros for closing down coal-fired power plants. Italy has been forced to pay 250 million euros for stopping a British company from exploring offshore for oil and gas. And so the total potential liability in terms of these investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms is in the hundreds of billions of dollars conservatively and in the trillions of dollars at the high end. And these provisions are also preventing states from taking the ambitious climate and environmental action that we so urgently need. So Denmark, France, and New Zealand drafted new regulations to stop offshore oil and gas exploration and then withdrew those regulations because of a fear of being sued for compensation by foreign investors. My friends, my colleagues, why do we allow the prioritization of foreign investors' rights over human rights? This needs to be reconsidered.
So there you have a sobering thought put forward by David Boyd at the end of his talk there. Now, what I'd just like to end with is to say that you've seen a lot of data. Data and data needs to lead to transformative behavior, not to just closing our minds, etc. And this latest IPC 6th assessment report publishes a lot of data, and it almost says, well, we're not on track for this 1.5. But it also says that many countries are doing positive things. And one of the things is, how do we stop these transnational companies from litigation actions against countries? And then it also mentions that there are many economic opportunities for countries when they take action in terms of energy, land, water, and food, settlements and infrastructure, health, society, livelihood, and the economy. So let's try and do our little bit. Coming up on March 25th is Earth Hour. So let's see if we can give 60 minutes to do something positive for our planet. I hand back to you, Tina. Thank you.
Felicia, okay, can you unmute yourself? All right.
I think I put it in the chat also, but I was very taken with the idea that there's a link between the feminine issues and the climate change, in that our sisters out in Africa are working on biodigesters for biogas as opposed to charcoal, etc. But I haven't reverted to the fact that they are also preventing a lot of women and girls from getting cancer through the carbon emissions in the kitchen, which is very important. And one of the sister who was doing these biogases, when they inaugurated the turning on the gas for the woman for the first time, the women, it was like a miracle. They were saying, this is a miracle that I can just have cooking gas without going and collecting wood and everything, just with a switch. They had never seen it before. They were thrilled. But I thought that's wonderful, a joy. But I never saw the connection with preventing deaths by doing it. So that was a big thing for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Felicia. Thank you very much for sharing that.
So first of all, thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar this evening. It was great to have you with us. And I just mentioned a few things that are coming up later in the year that you might want to keep an eye on. there's an annual meeting every year at the UN in New York called the High Level Political Forum, where countries review how they're performing on the SDGs. So that's one meeting in the middle of July, and there'll be 41 countries reporting on their implementation of the SDGs at that meeting in New York. There's going to be an SDGs summit at the UN General Assembly in September. And that'll be a big event as well, again, looking at the SDGs. And of course, there'll be a COP28 in December. It's going to be held in Dubai, and that will be in the first 12 days of December. So those are 3 events coming up in the year ahead connected with the SDGs and with climate change. So in addition to thanking yourselves, I want to thank Terry Dowling and Kevin Cawley for their 2 presentations. I want to thank Tino for the technological backup that he gives. And also I want to thank Flavia, our interpreter. So many thanks to them for what they added to the whole webinar.